Hello everyone. Today we're going to be working on Module 2, Lesson 1, and we'll be multiplying multi-digit whole numbers and multiples of 10 using place value patterns and the distributive and associative properties. So in Module 2 we are still using place value, but for now we're focusing on whole numbers and not decimals so we can learn some skills, and later we'll apply those to decimal numbers as well. Before I start with the rest of the lesson, I just want to review the distributive and associative properties. I had a few of my students from last year stop by on Friday, and I asked them what should I improve in my teaching this year, and they said that they thought I should spend more time talking about the properties because they're using those a lot in middle school. So as you recall, the distributive property means that you can break a number apart and multiply each part and find a simpler way to get your answer. For example, let's say I have a hard time remembering how to multiply my 7s, and I have 7 times 5. Well, I can break my 7 apart and turn that into 3 plus 4, if I happen to have my 3's memorized and my 4's memorized. And 3 times 5 is going to be 15. And 4 times 5 will be 20, and if I add that 15 and 20 together, I'll get 35. And sure enough, if I know my basic fact, 7 times 5 is 35. So some of you may be using the distributive property already to help you out when there are a few of those facts that you don't quite have, and I know it's harder to memorize the 7s, 8s, and 9s. So it's a good property to use when we're doing that. But basically the distributive property means we're breaking something apart and or decomposing it, and then we're multiplying each part separately. Then we add the parts up again, recomposing the number to get our final answer. Now the associative property is a property that says when we're adding or multiplying, it doesn't really matter which of the numbers we add or multiply first. And I'm just going to use multiplication this time around since that's what we're studying right now. So let's say that I have 3 times 4 times 5. And I can say I could do 3 times 4, which is 12, and multiply that times 5, and that's going to equal 60. Or, if I prefer, I could multiply 3 times 5 first, and then multiply that number by 4. So 3 times 5 is 15, and 15 times 4, oops, that should have been a 60 up there. 15 times 4 is also 60. So it doesn't matter what order I do the operation in. I'm still going to get the same answer. And this only works with addition and multiplication, and it only works if it's all addition or all multiplication. If you have different operations interspersed in there, you can't use this property. But if I only have multiplication signs, then the things that are being multiplied, I can move around and regroup, and I'll still get the right answer. So let's see how this applies to the lesson that we're doing tonight. I would like to multiply 4 times 30, and I'm going to use a place value chart just for this first one. And 30, of course, is 3 tens. So there's my 3 tens. And if I multiply 4 times 30, that means I have 1 group of 3, 2 groups of 3, 4 groups of 3, 3 groups of 3 and then 4 groups of 3. So I have 12 tens eventually. And what I know is that I can leave 2 of those 10s here. Oops, I should have made that smaller. And then the other 10, I'm going to move over here for 100, right? In other words, this 1 is coming over here, and I have 1, 2, 0, or 120 as my answer. So another way of looking at this problem without using a place value chart would be to think of this 30 as 3 times 10. We're actually breaking it down into its expanded form here, right? So I could think of this as 4 times and 30 in expanded form is 3 times 10. And then my next step would be to use the associative property to move those parentheses, because the parentheses tell me which part of the equation to do first. And you see I have only multiplication signs here, so it's okay to move the parentheses and use the associative property. And now I have 4 times 3 times 10. And of course 4 times 3 equals 12. And 12 times 10, now it's simply using place value to move all the digits one place to the left. So 12 times 10 will be 120. So that's a way, instead of using the place value chart, now I'm using the associative property, and I'm separating out that 10 and doing the math using a basic fact to find that product of 12, and then multiplying that by 10 to figure out what place the digits in my 12 need to be in. So now we're going to find the solution to 40 times 30, and we'll be using the associative property once again. And the first thing I want to do is break down 40 by its place value. So 40 is 4 times 10. And I'm going to start out with my parentheses around that so it looks like expanded form. And I want to multiply that 40 times 30, which of course, if I use expanded form, that's going to be 3 times 10. And so now you can see why we're doing expanded form, because it helps us see the patterns that are happening here and what's going on with the place value to get our answer. Now it's time for me to use the associative property, and that means I'm going to change the order. Once again, I'm checking to see that I have only multiplication, so that means that I can move the numbers around in any order I want and multiply them, and I'm still going to have the same answer. So now I'm going to group the 4 and the 3 together. So I have 4 times 3, and then I'll take the product of that part of my equation, and I'll multiply that by the 10 times 10 part. So I moved my 10s, so they're together, and then I moved the numbers that weren't 10s, so they were together. And of course, 4 times 3 is a basic fact. That equals 12. And 10 times 10, as we all know, is 10 to the second power, or 100. And 12 times 100 will be 12. And it will have 2 more zeros at the end. So the answer to 40 times 30 is 1,200, or 12 hundredths. Okay, now it's your turn. You're going to multiply 40 times 300, and I would like you to practice using the associative property. Even if you can look at this and you can get the answer right off the top of your head, I'd like you to use expanded form and parentheses, and then use the associative properties to group all the tens together and the digits that aren't tens together. And the reason for this is because later on we're going to be using the associative property for numbers that are more complicated than these. So this is a good time to practice using it. And if you can do this in your head, you can practice using the associative property and check yourself and make sure you're doing it right. So if you need to go back and look at the lesson before you answer the quiz, please do so. Make sure that you're feeling as confident as possible before you give your answer on the Edpuzzle quiz. Okay, I'm going to do a couple of these side by side now, and I'm going to use expanded form and the associative property to show you how similar these two problems are. One is 60 times 5, and the other is 60 times 50. So 60 times 5, I'm going to break down into 6 times 10 to get my 60, and I'll multiply that times 5. And over here on the right, when I have 60 times 50, I'm going to break that down into 6 times 10 to get the 60. There's my expanded form. And then I can write 50 in expanded form as well because it's a 5 times 10. And now I'm going to regroup the numbers, reorganize them using the associative property so that the numbers that aren't tens are grouped together. So in this one, I have 6 times 5. I've moved my 5 over here to go with the 6. And then the 10's going to come over here. I'm going to multiply that in there last of all. And the problem on the right, I am going to group the 6 and the 5 together again. And then I'm going to multiply that by the tens. So I'll put the two tens over here because we've practiced multiplying tens, and we know that if we have 10 times 10, it's 10 squared or 100. We can count the number of zeros to figure out what the product is. We can think of it as an exponent, which will tell us the number of zeros. So moving back over to the left, we know that 6 times 5 is 30. And if I multiply 30 times 10, I get 300 because all my digits will move one place to the left. And then if I look at, go over to the right, I've got 6 times 5, which is 30. And I'm going to multiply that by 10 times 10, or 10 squared, or 100 in standard form. And 30 times 100, I've got 2 zeros here. That means that the 3, it has to move 2 places to the left. Right now it's in the tens place. It's going to move to the hundreds and then to the thousands place. And my answer will equal 3,000. Now here's something I'd like to point out to you. A lot of times kids will look at a problem like this and say, oh, 6 times 5 is 30, and there's 2 zeros here, so my answer has to have 2 zeros, and they come up with 300. But the answer is not 300. It's actually 3,000, because 6 times 5 creates another zero of its own because it's a 2-digit product, 30, which has a 0 in the ones place. So you have to remember to account for that 0 that's in the 30 plus the 2 zeros that the 2 places we're going to move over because we're multiplying by 100 or 10 squared. So 300 is not the answer here. It has to be 3,000. Oh boy, it's your turn, and it's a big one. 60 times 5,000. So I know there's going to be many digits in my final answer. Please use the associative property, break this apart into expanded form, rearrange the numbers so you're multiplying all the tens by each other and then the numbers that aren't tens together before multiplying the whole thing and figuring out exactly where your digits will be placed. Remember to rewatch any part of the lesson you need to so you feel as confident as possible before you take the Edpuzzle quiz. Okay, here comes the fun stuff. This is the most complicated part of the lesson, so pay close attention. If you're getting fatigued, turn it off for a minute, have a snack, come back when you're ready to focus, because this is the complicated part of the lesson. So we're going to use the distributive property, which says that I can break one of the factors apart or decompose it before multiplying if that makes it easier for me. So what I'm going to do is take 451 and I'm going to decompose it by place value. And this is exactly what we do actually when we use the standard algorithm for multiplication. So I'm going to turn this into 400 plus 50 plus 1, and I'm going to multiply that times 8. And before I do that, I'm going to put it in a vertical position so you can see how similar it is to the standard algorithm. So I'm going to take this 8 and I'm going to multiply it by each of these parts separately. So I have 4 times 100, which is expanded form of 400, and I'm going to multiply that by 8. And then I'm going to add that to the next part. I'm going to take 8 times 50, which is 5 times 10, and I'll multiply that times 8. And then last of all, I'll just take this 1 times 8, and I don't really need to multiply 1 times 1. I know it's in the ones place, so it's just a 1. And then I'm going to regroup these things. So I have 4 times 8 times 100, and I've got 5 times 8 times 10. You see now I'm using the associative property and rearranging the order of the numbers, and this one's just going to stay at 1 times 8. And I have 4 times 8 is 32 times 100 is 3200. 5 times 8 is 40 times 10 means I have a 40. Whoops. I'm going to keep my digits lined up here. So 40 times 10 will be 400, and then 1 times 8, of course, will be 8. So I'm going to add all these together, and I get 8063, or 3608. All right, so we just figured out that 451 times 8 equals 3608. And so now we're going to do 451 times 80. And I bet many of you can guess what the product of this number is going to be, because it's going to be very similar to the product of our last equation. But I'm going to work through it. So first of all, I'm going to use the distributive property. I'm going to decompose 451 once again, and as you recall, that was 4 times 100 plus 5 times 10 plus 1. Okay, so we've taken this number and we have decomposed it, and then we're going to multiply each of those times 80, which is 8 times 10. And then we are going to use the associative property to reorganize our numbers. So now we have 4 times 8 times 100 times 10. And I'm going to go ahead and write that as 1,000. And then we have 5 times 8. We're going to multiply these numbers that aren't tens together. 5 times 8. And we're going to multiply that times 10 times 10, which is 100. And then, of course, the 1 times 80 is going to be 1 times 8 times 10. And unfortunately, I've run out of room, so I'm going to kind of move everything down here. 4 times 8 is 32 times 1,000. And that's going to be 32,000. And that was supposed to be a comma. And over here, 5 times 8 times 100. 5 times 8 is 40 times 100. And that will be 4,000. And then the last bit, 1 times 8 times 10, is going to be 8 times 10. And that will equal, whoops, not 8, but 80. Let me get that in the right place, 80. And unfortunately, I did not do the best job of keeping everything lined up here. When you're doing your work, you're going to want to do that. So I have 0, 0, 0 in the ones place, 0, 0s, and 8 in the tens place, and then a 0, 0, and a 0 in the hundreds place, a 2 and a 4 in the thousands place, and a 3 in the 10,000s place. So my answer will be 36,080. And if I compare this answer to this answer up here, I see I have the same digits, but they're all moved one place to the left, and that's because I have this extra 10 in here. Instead of multiplying by 8, I've multiplied by 8 times 10. All right, now it's your turn. Now you may be able to look at the pattern and make a really good guess about what the product of this problem is going to be. 4,510 times 80. And if you can make a good guess, do that. But what I would like you to do is then check your guess by breaking the numbers apart, using the distributive property to take out the tens and the associative property to regroup the tens, put it all back together and see if your guess was correct. Make sure that you are as confident as possible of your answer before you write it down on the Ed Puzzle quiz. Good luck, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.